Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll give it a moment or so for everyone to log in and join, and we will get started shortly. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. It is certainly good to have you on board today. I'm Julia, Technical Director of Mott Macdonald, and we're here today to talk about habitat management and monitoring plans for England's mandatory biodiversity net gain. It's not been that long, has it? I mean, 12th of February was day one, when that's just under 4 months. It's not been that long at all. And already it seems like such an achievement and such a milestone. I guess it's fair to say before day one, there was so much talk about biodiversity net gain and a lot about the metric. And we were absolutely talking about the long-term aspects of mandatory B&G and talking about management and monitoring plans. And there were some great case studies there. But day one changed things. In day one, from day one, we've got management and monitoring plans that are a legal requirement. And that's where we're going to start today. We'll start about the legal requirements for HMMPs, and then we'll go into the Natural England template. So with me today is Maria. Maria.
Hi, thanks, Julia. Hello, everybody. My name's Maria Hardy. I work in the Biodiversity Net Gain policy team in Natural England. And for the last 3 years or so, I've been looking at the quality assurance side of biodiversity net gain. And one of the things we wanted to do was look at how to standardize habitat management and monitoring plans. And that's how we've come towards doing this webinar today. And we'll talk about that later. Thanks.
We certainly will do. Behind the scenes, we have Michael from DEFRA and Colette from Natural England, who are grateful thanks. They will be looking and answering your questions. If you do have questions, please keep them coming in. I think you've got a Q&A. You should have a Q&A button on your Zoom. If not, use the chat, but if you can, use the Q&A. So we've got Michael and Colette behind the scenes. And as always, a huge thank you to the CIEEM team for hosting us on these webinars. So let's make a start. There might be people who are new to biodiversity net gain, so it's always worth a quick reminder about what it is. What is biodiversity net gain? And this was really established in 2016 when we published our good practice principles. We set the benchmark. This is development that leaves biodiversity in a measurably better state than beforehand. And development achieves that improvement in biodiversity by creating or enhancing wildlife-rich habitats. We now have mandatory biodiversity net gain, and this is for most development seeking planning permission. So it's those development seeking planning permission unless they're exempt. For development subject to mandatory net gain, they follow what's called the biodiversity gain hierarchy, which is a material consideration for local planning authorities when they're reviewing the biodiversity gain plans. And we'll certainly come to this point about on-site significant enhancements. And just to illustrate the biodiversity gain hierarchy, it starts off with avoidance and reduction of those very high, and medium distinctiveness habitats. Then there's a series of steps to achieve your biodiversity net gain. And it's all about considering and prioritizing these steps in turn. And for us developers, we need to clearly show and demonstrate we follow the biodiversity gain hierarchy in justifying each step of the way. So local planning authorities can see this as a material consideration in everything else that they've got to weigh up. So we first think about enhancing on-site habitats. And, you know, I love that. I love that because it's really flipped the conversation. You would might have, like a valuable habitat that's quite degraded, that's quite down and out, and before that would be like brushed aside. But now those are the gems, if you like, the jewels, to really think in terms of they're going to be a great B&G solution for you. So enhance on site, then create habitats on site. Only then you look for local offsite provision, and as the very last resort, and it really is the last resort when you think about the time and the cost involved with this, developers can apply to purchase statutory credits from the government. We'll come back to the importance of what's called significant on-site enhancements in terms of the HMMP. Now, these are areas of habitat enhancement or creation. I know, it's a little bit confusing, so I do want to make this point. They're both habitat enhancement or creation that are on site, which contribute significantly to biodiversity net gain, and that's relative to the biodiversity value. So it's habitats on site, whether they are created or enhancement, that are the contributing factor, the contributing reason to getting that biodiversity net gain. And there's some examples there of habitats of medium or high distinctiveness. Now, retained habitats don't count as on-site significant enhancements, and we will absolutely touch on the fact that retained habitats might need long-term management. So that is absolutely a given. So we'll come back to that point. The point that we want to make is it's really up for the ecologist to go through this assessment, to make the assessment of what could be on-site significant enhancements, and then the LPA ultimately judges whether they are or not. But when they are decided, these on-site significant enhancements must be secured with a legal agreement for at least 30 years, the same as off-site gains. And we'll go to how that plays out with an HMMP. So coming back to the core aspects for anyone who is quite new to mandatory biodiversity net gain, it's measured by the statutory biodiversity metric as a minimum of a 10% increase. And the way that the metric works, it calculates those biodiversity units. And we've talked about the on-site significant enhancements, and off-site gains must be legally secured for a minimum of 30 years. That's a very quick whistle-stop tour. There is plenty more about mandatory biodiversity net gain. Thank you to CIEEM, who's put our webinars earlier this year on the YouTube channel. So if you want to know more, by all means, just dive in. A shout out to CIEEM. These websites are really, really handy. They've got two. One is enhancement across the UK, and then one is those biodiversity net gain resources for England. And also, big shout out to Faye, CIEEM, IEMA and Syria. We have just published our short guide to mandatory biodiversity net gain, and I put the link on the slide there. Okay. I think it's worth touching on though, and I do sometimes, I don't get lost, but there's just a lot with mandatory net gain. You've got the on-site significant enhancement, you've got the biodiversity gain hierarchy, the biodiversity gain plan. I mean, we just need to come back to this point. We constantly have to come back to this point. This is the step change. Developments that create or enhance more wildlife-rich habitats for that minimum of 30 years. And that is the step change. And let's not lose sight of that, because the only way that can be achieved is when we have a sound design based on sound ecological principles and that long-term management. So speaking about an HMMP, Maria, let's start from this point. What exactly is an HMMP?
Well, it really comes back to the legal agreement, because that is the law, if you like, and you need to know about whether you're going to maintain the habitat in that legal agreement, who's responsible for creating and enhancing it, and who's responsible for maintenance, management and monitoring. And the habitat management and monitoring plan is really just a way of putting that information into a structured approach. And so the management and monitoring plan will include information about the baseline for the site, and then what you plan to do to create and enhance those habitats, and then what you plan to do to manage and monitor them for the 30 years or more. And so in a nutshell, that's what a habitat management and monitoring plan is. people will have already done management plans in the past, probably for a timescale of 5 years or so on. And this is not really that different from that. The difference is, as you say, it's a step change. Now we are going to be managing habitats for 30 years or more. And so it's really important that we think about how we're going to monitor them, because that is how we're going to know whether that management is working and whether what is planned in the legal agreement is happening as planned. So the management and monitoring plan is a way to show both the reviewers, like the local authority or the responsible body, what you plan to do, but also to show those people that are responsible for managing it on the ground what it is you want them to do. And we'll talk a little bit more about the timescales, but even though it's for 30 years, it doesn't mean that you don't look at it again for 30 years. There will be review, but we'll talk about that as we go forward a bit later.
Absolutely, and I think it comes back to you know, the from day one that was such a change. You know, so we've got the step change with development creating more wildlife rich habitats, but we've got the step change from day one. So I want to be absolutely clear: what are the legal requirements under mandatory biodiversity net gain for an HMMP?
So legally, you need to show how you're going to maintain the habitat, who will be responsible for creating and enhancing if it's on-site significant enhancements, and there is guidance in the gov.uk guidance on what is significant. But usually what we say is assume it will be significant, most will be, and we can possibly talk about that a bit later because there's a lot to talk about there. It will be required for offsite biodiversity net gain, and you require a habitat management and monitoring plan when you register a site. And I should have said for the on-site, you require it with the gain plan. And it's also important in the habitat management and monitoring plan that you set out who will be doing that management and monitoring.
So, and thank you. I think it's worth just starting off with those, you know, legal requirements. So an HMMP is legally required for on-site significant enhancements,
Yes.
certainly for off-site provision. And I just want to raise this now. It might be needed for retained habitats. So when you put a retained habitat in the biodiversity metric, you're effectively saying that habitat will be retained at the end of 30 years, and that might need management. So more to come on that, but we just want to raise the headlines of that at the moment. So there's legal requirements and when it might be actually needed as well. Now, Marie, you've talked about the HMMP and then the legal agreement, and there's been some sort of discussion and questions about, well, is the HMMP the legal agreement? Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, it is a little bit confusing. The HMMP is not the legal agreement. The legal agreement, as you've got the text up there now from creating a habitat management and monitoring plan on gov.uk, the legal agreement sets out how you'll maintain the habitat, who's responsible for creating and enhancing the habitat, and who's responsible for maintenance and management and monitoring. But it doesn't say specifically that that needs to be in the form of a habitat management and monitoring plan. Instead, the guidance says that you can use a habitat management monitoring plan to provide more information. Now, what you can do is you can put that information within the legal agreement, or you can append it to the legal agreement. But at the end of the day, it's important to think about how can you get this information across in a way that can be managed for the 30 years or more. And that's why we're promoting the idea of doing it in the form of a habitat management and monitoring plan, because that's a clearly set out way that you show how you're going to do that work to manage and monitor for the 30 years or more.
Yeah, and I think, thank you for just highlighting that. So we've got it in, essentially it's the plan. You know, people follow the plan, it's the management, it's the maintenance. What is the plan? Which is very different from, okay, I need a legal agreement to work from that. And the legal agreement can signpost or can include the plan, but this is the actual plan. Now, one of the questions that kind of come up is, and what you've just said there, you know, let's use the HMMP to provide more information, but it doesn't replace that legal agreement. One of the questions that comes up is, when do we submit it to the local planning authority? And let's unpack that. We've got the, this is from gov.uk, from the guidance. You should submit a draft HMMP with your planning application. So that gives us a bit of a heads up there. And what we find is, and this is just kind of a personal experience in terms of with the planning application, from the projects worked on to date, certainly from my end, there is absolutely the information that we have for an HMMP for on-site B&G. So at planning application stage, on-site B&G, we submit the HMMP. And that's also about giving the LPAs confidence that biodiversity net gain can be achieved if they approve the planning application. Maria, what then happens after planning?
Yeah, well, actually, this is all laid out in the planning practice guidance, and we'll send the link to that so that people can see that if they haven't already. What they must do is submit a final HMMP with a biodiversity gain plan for the significant on-site. But that comes after planning permission is granted. But as Julia says, it's really important, and in the guidance, it does explain to people that it's good practice to submit a draft habitat management and monitoring plan earlier, because it's very difficult to just suddenly sort of land this upon all the decision makers afterwards. So technically, you must do it as part of the gain plan, but best practice is that you submit a draft earlier, and then you can have the conversations with the local planning authority on, you know, what you're planning, and it will make it a lot easier for everybody to understand what the plans are.
Yeah, and I think it's that place, isn't it, when best practice actually marries up with what makes business sense. You know,
Precisely.
yeah, I mean, you know, you're submitting a planning application to get planning. It just kind of makes business sense. You know, let's give the LPAs confidence that biodiversity net gain will be achieved. Here's our landscape design. Here's the planting specification. You might have done some soil testing. Here's the management plan. So you're really giving that confidence, absolutely. And you're, you know, from a business point of view, just reducing the risk of delays through planning, I guess.
Precisely. I think you're giving everybody confidence, including yourselves, because it's actually quite tricky to think about in advance how you're going to manage that land, and it's probably a bit of an evolving process. And if you put in a draft, then you've always got the opportunity to have conversations with people, and by the time you come to put in the final version, you will have had an opportunity to, you know, to update it if needed to get it right for everybody concerned and the decision makers. So I think it's really a good practice thing to do for everybody's benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the way that we're kind of like front loading B&G all the time, you know, just kind of makes business sense. And obviously that is good practice to do that. So for those of you hopefully know about the biodiversity gain plan, there's a template from DEFRA. So it's a template, it's not a statutory instrument, but it is pretty useful. It has that box 4.12. So you submit that, the final one, after planning, but engage the local planning authorities as early as possible on the biodiversity gain plan. And it's just to highlight where that comes in with that. So one of the questions that comes up is that on some projects, they might require a LEMP, and now we have an HMMP for mandatory biodiversity net gain. Can you merge them? You know, are they the same? Are they different? Let's not get bogged down with paperwork. Let's actually focus on doing biodiversity net gain. And just want to highlight a couple of things. So there's a general definition about an LEMP, site-specific documentation with immediate and long-term commitments to manage the planting, protection and enhancement of biodiversity on a development site in accordance with the various policies, the MPPF and other local plans. So for those in this industry for a while, you might be familiar with the LEMP, it's pretty similar, but it is different. The HMMPs are specifically for the purposes of mandatory biodiversity net gain, demonstrating and having the plan in terms of managing habitats, monitoring those habitats for the minimum 30-year duration of B&G. Can they be merged? You know, I think it's one of these things where there's no like single answer. It's about being aware that this is a question and then looking. Go for it.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Julia. I was just going to say, there's no right answer here, really. It will depend on the type of scheme that you're planning and whether or not you already have an LEMP planned as part of that. And it is a bit to do with the timescales as well. So we talked about previously in conversations about maybe the LEMP is needed at the beginning, and then after, say, 1 year, you might choose to use an HMMP. However, I think it's worth thinking about, again, the best practice. It's not a rule or anything, but it may be beneficial to kind of incorporate the two together if that's possible. Where possible, combine them to ensure consistency. But the HMMP itself is not on its own a legal requirement. It's legally required to have that management and monitoring information. The way to do it, we can talk about when we talk about the template, but I think it's just about thinking what's the most efficient and the most consistent way of doing it. But the most important thing for the legal requirement is that you must provide the right management and monitoring information that's needed for biodiversity net gain.
Yeah, and I think that's the point, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's, you know, the LEMP, and I love the way the Natural England template set this out. So some of the LEMPs aren't as specific to B&G as we need the HMMP to do. So for this one, be armed and ready. Right, be ready for this question, and then just think what is going to be best for your project. It might be that the LEMP has a very specific remit or specific landscaping purposes that you need that information in there. And then the HMMP is very specific to the target habitats, those target conditions in the biodiversity metric, as well as, you know, how do you get there? We've certainly had projects where we do have merged them. I mean, it's, you know, let's, as Maria, as you've just said, you know, let's get really specific, but just be mindful of that. So that there's no blanket answer. It's about being armed and ready for that question and really understanding what are the key purposes of each document and what's the best way to get there, I think. Okay, we've talked about it quite a lot. Now, before we dive into Natural England's template, you did do a YouTube. So we're going to assume you haven't seen the YouTube. If you have, you're in for a bit of a refresh, which is no bad thing. But we have put the link to the YouTube channel as well. So there is more if you indeed want it afterwards.
Yeah, and can I just say there, Julia, that was done before mandatory biodiversity net gain. So I think a lot of it is still very much the same as what we're talking about today, but it was done before we knew exactly what the guidance was, though there were a few little question marks. Now a lot of that is a bit more clear on gov.uk, and you've got the link there to the creating a habitat management and monitoring plan. So I would just say to people to keep looking at gov.uk. They do periodically update the guidance, not at the moment because we're in the election period, but once we're post-election, if there need to be any changes, that will be the most up to date, is all I'm saying. Whereas the video is we probably need to do an update at some point.
It's fast moving space, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, it's just extraordinary and great. Okay, so we'll send the slides afterwards as well. What we wanted to do is just pull out key aspects of the guidance, you know, related to HMMP. So you have these as well. I know what it's like going through all those guidance documents on BNG. So Maria, this one, if you talk us through and just to kind of, I guess, emphasize what you're just saying, you know, the guidance is quite specific about, gosh, sorry. Right, there we go.
Giving it all away now.
That's I know.
Thank you. So yeah,
go for it.
Thanks, Julia. This is from the guidance page, and it's quite a summary really, it doesn't give a lot of detail, but it does give you the key points. So one of the things about the habitat management and monitoring plan is you should work with an ecologist or a competent professional to write the plan. The reason for this is that it can be quite complicated. You're looking at what habitats are already on a site, then what you want to retain, what you want to propose through the metric, how will you manage those, and how will you monitor them. So it is quite an ecological thing for the main template. So you need to say how you're going to manage the offsite gains or the significant on-site enhancements. And you need to think about other legal restrictions and requirements as well, such as for protected sites and protected species. Because with biodiversity net gain, as I'm sure you know, the existing legislation and requirements are still in place and still apply. So biodiversity net gain is addition to that. So you need to be aware of that. You need to think about how you're going to monitor, and that will depend on the type of habitat. So if you've got various habitats, you'll have to think about different types of monitoring appropriate to those habitats. And also think about when you're going to report the monitoring results in to the local authority or the responsible body, and that can be set out in the management plan. The plan is for 30 years or more, but you will review it from time to time, possibly every 5 years or so. And you might have some specific requirements coming in from the local authority that they want to include. So it's important that you have a competent ecologist. I would just say one thing, there's also a small sites metric, habitat management and monitoring plan template. And we're saying that people who are using the small sites metric and who are competent in those small sites type habitats may not be an ecologist, they may be a landscape architect or another professional, then they can use the small sites template. But that's us getting onto the template now. So just to say that about the competency.
So this was back in the day when we were talking about BNG and talking about, there was guidance out there about management and monitoring plans, but not specifically for BNG. And Maria, I really, really appreciated, you just really understood this need. And so thank you for that, because, as you mentioned earlier on in development, it was probably 5-10 years. I mean, now and again, you'd have more of a, there would be a development with a long-term plan for its, tended to be habitat mitigation, but that was quite rare. And the longer term plans tended to be in the conservation world, which are absolutely great. We're learning so much from them, but not specifically about BNG. So you listened when we talked about, I think this is a bit of a gap, but can you just say from your point of view, why did you feel this was important to develop a,
Yeah, so Natural England had been talking with partners about quality assurance and different ideas around that, and accreditation and things, which is a much broader subject than what we're talking about today. But one of the things that had come out of that earlier conversation with stakeholders was that a real risk in biodiversity net gain was around the management and monitoring, and how are we going to know that that's happening as it should do. So quite early on, there was, I'm talking now back in 2021, there was a need felt for a template, and Natural England took the lead on that and got permission to work with a consultant. So it went out through a competitive tender, and FPCR consultants came in to help us to do that, and worked really closely with stakeholders. And the point of the plan was to provide a structure, to provide a standardization and a consistency in the way that these plans would be developed and put into the reviewers, the local authority or the responsible body. So I really want to get across to everybody that the stakeholders helped shape these templates, the main template and the small sites metric habitat management and monitoring plan template. And this was a kind of iterative process over a couple of years with lots of drafts, and then user testing, and then redrafting, and so on. So I really hope that what we've come up with at the end of it is a result of all of that user input and the expert help that we got through the consultants that led on that project, but also through all of the people that we talked to in the process.
And this is the website. So we put the link here. This is the website. And as you scroll down, you'll come to all of these documents. So Marie, can you just take us through? I mean, and being part of that process was, and shout out to those consultants, they did such a lovely, engaging job with that and really took on board the feedback. But when you come to this bit, there's quite a lot. So
yes.
So
you've got the landing
documents?
page, which was just flashed up a moment ago, which is on Natural England's Access to Evidence page. So these are not mandatory documents, I must say. They are voluntary documents, but the idea is to help you as authors if you're writing a management and monitoring plan, but also to help the people who have to deliver that management to have a clear plan in front of them, and for the reviewers, like the local authorities or the responsible bodies, to be able to see what it is you're proposing. So there are a few different documents, and the reason for those is we wanted to keep a quite simple template, and the first template that was developed is the first document in the list, the Habitat Management and Monitoring Plan template, which is the main one for most sites. And then sort of the sixth down the list, which is second from the bottom, is the Small Sites Metric Habitat Management and Monitoring Plan template. And this was identified as a need for people who are working on sites which require the use of the small sites metric, and therefore not as many different types of habitats and different distinctiveness and so on, not quite as complicated as the main. They could use this other template. And then the other documents are supplementary documents that go along with them. So for example, the companion document provides all the different habitat types with a reference to the condition assessment criteria, and you only need to select out of those the ones that are relevant to your project and import those into the template. So these are more for reference and using as you need, whereas the templates are to fill out, just like any other template, you fill out the boxes. There's also a checklist, but I'll talk a bit about that later. It's okay, Julia, and we'll catch that later. Yeah.
So just to raise the point, it's the top one, which is the main one, and then you have a whole host of other kind of resources there. So this is the top one. This is the actual template, and we've just made the point. You don't have to use it. I think it's really good. It provides that consistency. And again, for local planning authorities, rather than getting every which way but west, there's something they can expect to see. And obviously really tailor make it to your site, because this always has to be proportionate. So the information is legally required, and this is a template to help, and this is the main one to go through. So Maria, let's just kind of walk everyone through this. So you open up the page and you start off with the project background, the management, the monitoring schedule. Can you kind of walk us through those three main chapters?
Yeah, so there's 3 sections in the plan, and in the actual template, each of these you can click on them and just move straight into that section as well. They're links through. It's important to have the project background. This provides the context to what it is you're trying to do and the baseline information. Now, we're not trying to duplicate what's in the metric, but the metric is a very specific sort of output of a calculation. This is more of just a summary of what's important, and also a bit of a checklist about what's important in the baseline. So things like environmental information, protected species and habitats background, soils and hydrology and things like that are in that environmental baseline information. And so the template is a way of you presenting your information, but it also gives you a sort of guide as well as you go along, and gives you prompts to remind you the sort of things that you might want to include. The other thing that's really important to include is a plan or a map, and that's just so helpful to anybody to understand how your site fits in the context of the local area and what it is you're planning to do. It has that key information in there that's required legally, the roles and responsibilities. And so that's all in the background section. And in the planned management activities section, this is really the crux of the plan. This is what you intend to do for each of those habitats. What is it you're going to retain? Which ones are you going to create and enhance? And what are the management targets and prescriptions? And that's where, with the main template, you can go to the companion document. Say you are intending to produce a pond, for example, you can go across to that and pull out the pond template, which gives you those condition assessment criteria. So the template itself is a set of boxes, but the complexity of it from our point of view in developing it is that it gives you a guide all the way through of what you need to do. And then finally, the monitoring schedule. This is what you intend to do for the monitoring, and this is important to tell that local authority or responsible body what it is you're intending to do. And you have to think about that appropriate to the type of habitats that you're proposing. And also think about the what ifs. Things change. You might need to think about slightly adapting your plan as you go along. And there's a section in there which also gives you a little bit of a prompt on adaptive management and how to think about making sure that your plan is really resilient into the future. So within the main template, you're not actually doing the monitoring, you're just showing people how you're going to do the monitoring. And then there's a separate template which you can send in later on, maybe in a year's time, to report on the actual monitoring. And that's one of those documents in the list that we looked at earlier.
And I love that interchange between, I love the way you called it a companion document, by the way. I don't know who came up with that, but it was like, yes, no, thank you. That really helps answer the question. So we have the template and we have the series of boxes that we're going to go through a couple of them now, but do use that companion document. It's super helpful. And there is more to come about what if things change. Today, we're going to be focused actually on the management monitoring for that aspect, but that's certainly a discussion for the future. What I really like about this is that you open the document and then you've got a plan on the page. I mean, it's just the summary management. So habitats to be retained. We will absolutely come back to them because some of them need management over the 30 years, created and enhanced. You've got the timescales for actions, those monitoring requirements that you've talked about. People, what's really nice about this is required consents and licenses. That's not always front of mind. And you might need that. So again, you're putting that, really roping that in to that fronter page here. Funding, how has funding been secured? And what I really like about this, Maria, is that you're prompting our questions really early on. Like if we're producing a drafted planning application, we've got to answer that question, in terms of, well, how is, making sure that it is absolutely secured, and then an overview of the legal agreements to secure delivery of that.
Yes, if I can just come in there, you might,
yeah,
if you were putting in a draft at an earlier stage, then you might not have all of this information 100% tied up, but the benefit of it is it's getting you to think about that then, and you can put in a note here, this is a draft and we're, this is what we're busy with. The sections of the plan, if I can just say, it's mainly got these green headings, but then the bit of text underneath is in grey. It might not show on your screen very easily, but it's in grey. And this is just really a prompt to remind you what you can put in that box. You can delete that out and just write over it if you want to. So it's just to remind you, for example, with the timescales for action, summarize the key timescales covered in the plan. And it just gives you a little bit of a heads up what's helpful in that section.
Yeah, which is really nice actually. And again, a bit of a heads up as we walk you through main parts of the HMMP template by Natural England. It is very helpful because it asks you these questions: who's going to be responsible? And what I'm certainly finding on our projects is like, I need to have that conversation, rather than too late in the day and kind of, well, who's going to be responsible? Right up front, we're thinking about, well, who's going to be responsible? And you've just made the really good point. You might not know that immediately at planning, but you do need to know that for the final HMMP that goes in the biodiversity game plan. The biodiversity game plan has to be approved before works can start. So it's all brilliantly like front loading B&G. And you've touched on the competencies needed to write an HMMP. So I think we can come back to the monitoring schedule. So one of the big questions is every year, every 5 years, every 10 years. And what you've just said, Maria, is depends on your habitats,
It does.
right? And there's not a general rule of thumb, is there?
Yeah, it does. So it can get a little bit confusing here when we talk about monitoring, because people think, well, monitoring's in different circumstances. For example, the local authority has will be doing some monitoring, but that would be more of an overview. That would be, is the biodiversity net gain happening like they said it would? That's different. What we're talking about within this plan is for the habitats. So when you monitor a developing woodland, it would be very different from monitoring a pond. Obviously, you need to think about the habitat and how you would monitor, and that's why you do probably need a competent ecologist most of the time, unless it's a quite straightforward small sites metric type situation, in which case a landscape architect or another professional may be, perfectly familiar with these types of things. On the whole, thinking about how you monitor, what sort of scale, and what the intervals are, and the timing of that. So this is all going to be put into your plan. And the boxes that appear within the template, this is just showing on one slide here, they can all be extended, or you can cut them down depending on what your site is. It's very much a template to use for your purposes, for the size of your site and the complexity. So if all you've got is one line, you just need to put one line in and you can delete out the rest, or you can extend it if you need to.
What I think is really nice about this one is it's not just what are you going to monitor, when you're going to, it's the how, the methods, the monitoring methods. And we're really thinking now early on, and we'll come back to how that's related to habitat condition assessments, but it's like, are you going to estimate, the percentage cover? You're going to need quadrat sampling. This is really the bulletproof approach, and it says, robust strategy is critical to monitor success and challenges to feed into the plan. So there's the monitoring, the updates to maybe the local planning authority, but then there's the monitoring to feed into this plan in terms of how it's working, and making sure that at this really early stage, we're actually saying, well, these are the methods to work. What I would say is that you've touched on this in terms of, there's monitoring to feed into the plan, making sure that, is the plan working? And then there's the monitoring reports to the local planning authorities. We're running some training for local planning authorities, and what comes up is such a great question, is how do they collect the data to submit their 5 years plan? So it's something for local planning authority colleagues on the call. If you are working with developers to receive these monitoring reports, to receive the data, is there a way that you can receive that makes it far more streamlined for when you then report on your 5-year reports on B&G?
Yes. So the management and monitoring plan will be quite a detailed document, and what you're planning to do will be quite a detailed document, whereas the monitoring report template, which is also on the access to evidence page, that gives you the opportunity to just summarize. There's a Word document on there which provides the opportunity to put in more descriptive data. It may be that going forward, what you're actually reporting on is quite repetitive data. It might be updating on the quantitative side of things. So there's also an Excel sheet, and that's a much simpler thing. And I think there's an opportunity there for you to be able to input sort of quantitative data, and the local authority could potentially just take those reports and amalgamate them together and get quantitative data for their local authority area. It's still quite a manual approach. I think we haven't really covered this, Julia. I'm probably just going off on a slight tangent. But when we talked initially about the template, we wanted to have a digitally enabled singing all dancing template. And that was a lovely ambition. Actually, when we talked to people about it, stakeholders, it soon became apparent that it would be better, for now anyway, to have a Word document, simply because there are different abilities in terms of not abilities, but availabilities of technological equipment and so on like that. So we have to make sure this is accessible for everybody. But it is,
absolutely. And
yeah.
I think one of the things that's quite important with that is, like, this can absolutely evolve over time. Absolutely. So just to summarize, it's useful to map out the monitoring that you'll be doing. There is that monitoring to inform the plan. Is the plan working, and making sure that that adaptive management is in place? There's the monitoring for local planning authorities, and for local planning authorities, they're collecting the monitoring data, and then they've got their 5-year reporting to do as well. Okay. Target condition. I'll run through this bit, and then Maria will bring you back in when it comes to the start dates. So one of the things, and this is probably going to help with that discussion of the difference between the LEMP and the HMMP, when you go through the Natural England template, what's most important is that we have confidence that the ongoing management and monitoring will get us those target conditions that are in the biodiversity metric. So as you go through this, it says, okay, what's your baseline habitat? What's your target habitat? So it asks you, it's so brilliantly closely related to the biodiversity metric post-development calculation. It says, okay, what's your baseline condition? What's your target condition? What's the years to target condition? So those of you who are familiar with the biodiversity metric, your probably mind is hopefully whirling right now. It's like, yeah, that's in the metric. So it's here. It's not a way to replicate this. It's a way to bulletproof that what's in your metric post-development target conditions really have that sense of a management plan behind them, and it's all laid out, it's all clear, but you can make this proportionate to your development project, and then it prompts you here to do this. So it's a way that the template is so closely related to those target conditions. Talking about the target conditions, and this is something that we teach on the on some of our B&G training courses. The habitat condition assessments, which you would use to assess your baseline, and for those of you who know it, you have a range of criteria, and then at your baseline you would assess, does it pass or does it fail? When you're designing biodiversity net gain, when you're designing habitat creation or enhancement, fill in that box. So it's a way that you can use these criteria and say, well, at the end of 30 years, would I have a habitat that's a really good representation of this habitat type? Would I have a sward height that's varied and creates microclimate that provides opportunities for insects? Will I have a cover of bare ground? And what that does brilliantly so is that you say, okay, what's the design measures and what's the HMMP measures that I need to go through each conditioning criteria and say, would that be a pass at the end of 30 years? So it's a really good structured approach, and I really love the way the Natural England template kind of works in that. And it just comes,
sort of aligns closely with that companion document that I was talking about. It's that similar crossover with the metric there to help you, prompt you with what information you need to put in.
absolutely. And this is from the user guide, so everything is kind of so closely related together in terms of, you've got the metric, you've got the user guide saying be appropriate, so we're constantly saying, okay, what's best for biodiversity, what's the ambition, but what's going to be feasible and viable, set those target outcomes, and then you've got that really close link to the template and the companion document. Okay, we've talked about retained habitat, so let's go through this. So the statutory metric user guide, habitat subject to retention may still need management. So I know they're not on-site significant enhancements, they don't need a legal agreement, but if you're saying in the biodiversity metric that that habitat will be retained, that means that you will pop up in 30 years time and see that habitat, exactly that target of that retained condition there in 30 years, and it might need management. So just to kind of go through this, habitats marked as retained in the statutory metric means that retained type, condition, area, strategic significance will be there in 30 years' time. To give you an example of how this works, it's just making clear that some, not all habitats, but some habitats marked as retained need that long-term management. Otherwise, they'll be, they could well decline. And the metric does have a way of putting in a decline in habitat type and condition. So if there's no management and it's likely that that habitat will decline over the 30 years, it shouldn't be marked as retained. You should absolutely put it as a decline. To go through this and excuse the rather basic graphics, but say you have a woodland in moderate condition, and then there's a development, and this is very, very general, and you've gone through the biodiversity gain hierarchy, but I'm just kind of giving you an example here. So that hard standing of that development has cleared, they've avoided, reduced the woodland clearance as much as possible. The point being, that woodland is marked as retained in the biodiversity metric. All right, so it's a woodland in moderate condition, marked as retained in the biodiversity metric. Now, if I'm looking at that, I would first just take a step back, and I would think, well, actually, and this is my kind of imaginary line, that's probably going to be now woodland edge, where that was core woodland before, and that's now woodland edge. So my first question is, well, would that woodland edge, I mean, would that be retained woodland? I mean, it might be more of an edgy, scrubby habitat that's now might be subject to wind throw and things like that. So that's a first question. But coming back to the rest of that woodland, if that has no management at all over the 30 years, and again, this is just an example, but if that woodland is marked as retained but without any management, chances are it might well decline. You know, it might have invasive species or inappropriate use, whatever that might be. So it's a way of thinking really holistically about what's in your post-development metric calculation and thinking, what of those habitats need management and maintenance over the 30 years? So just bear that one in mind.
Yeah, and if I can just come in there. Oh,
Yeah.
I've come in, and I am about to come in anyway on this one. There is a table in the template, and Julia's got the slide here, which prompts you to think about the measures to be implemented to protect retained habitats, and any protective measures to be used. And the grey text in each of these boxes just again provides you with some little prompts to think about, like set out how protective measures will be implemented and maintained to protect all the retained habitats throughout the project. So by looking at the template, even if you don't use the template, you can use it as a guidance document as well. You can either use it as it is, or you can still look at it as guidance to remind you about these things. And it's good to have a plan too.
Absolutely. Okay. In the last few minutes of this webinar, we know that there's loads of questions coming in, so we'll certainly get to them afterwards. I want to go through the start date, and then we'll just touch on a question about offset providers. Maria.
Yes.
When does the clock start?
Yes, this was an actual question from a previous conversation. When does the clock start ticking? And it's actually clearly laid out in the guidance in Enter a Legal Agreement for Biodiversity Net Gain on gov.uk. So this is the section from that guidance here. For on-site BNG, the 30-year maintenance period starts when you complete the development. And for off-site, it is when you complete the habitat enhancement work. And so that's when your legal agreement starts, and the habitat management and monitoring plan would align with that. So that's it in a nutshell. There was a question that came in around, well, how do you know when the enhancement has completed? I mean, basically, I would say, you know, the enhancement is enhancement or creation when you plant the trees, sow the meadow, create the pond or something like that. You may then have a short period of settling in, and then you may set up the legal agreement. I think the details are on a project by project basis, but in terms of when you feel you've finished that enhancement, but it's within a sensible period, probably within a year, I would think. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Julia, from your practical experience on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that the first point, as always, so I'm speaking about, a B&G ecologist, so I know that I need a very clear start date of the 30-year clock when the legal agreement starts, and that's the maintenance period, right? So we've planted the woodland or created the pond, and it's the maintenance period. We have a rule of thumb. I do treat this as a rule of thumb because it's going to vary for each and every project. A rule of thumb is on site. The maintenance period starts when you've completed the development. I mean, that kind of makes sense, right? But it does vary. You know, sometimes you have the end of construction, then there's the landscaping, then there's the immediate aftercare, and then it goes into maintenance. So know that you need a clear start date of the 30-year clock. Some people put in the habitat creation and aftercare in the HMMP, but you do need the HMMP to cover the 30-year of the maintenance period. So it's, for me, it's about being armed and ready, but this question is a really important one to answer, to know that it's about the legal agreement of the maintenance period, and to know that the HMMP has to cover that 30 years, even if it's actually technically covered afterwards. And you just have to be transparent about it. And that engagement with your LPA is probably going to be quite important. And look at this as a rule of thumb to then really work on a project by project basis, if that's fair. We did have a final question, and then we'll jump to the question about the offset providers. So Maria, this one, details about the long-term management. Is there any indication of the associated costs? And this is about those responsible bodies.
Yeah, so on this second question, it's important that the management and monitoring is the responsibility of the landowner to fulfill their legal agreement. So the actual management and monitoring isn't the responsible body's responsibility. They would have the agreement with that person doing the management and monitoring. The responsible bodies themselves, they apply to take up the role, they choose to take up the role to become a responsible body, and they'll set their costs and offer these transparently when they set up agreements. And so although we know some of the costs have come out already from some responsible bodies, we expect that this will settle, you know, in time as more responsible bodies come forward. So there is a government gov.uk guidance on criteria for being a responsible body, which we can share in the chat or the after event details. So really, it's all about that criteria and the responsible bodies. So we don't have an indication of the associated costs as such, but that will be something that the responsible bodies organise themselves.
And a final question, and then we'll kind of wrap up. We had a few questions, and understandably, about, oh, hang on, we're an offset provider and we might already be running our land or a nature reserve. We've already got management plans. Do we need an HMMP? Maria, what would your advice be for that?
Yeah, well, the template, which is what we've been talking about just now, is a voluntary template. So you don't have to use that. You can use your own management plans. And we've talked to people when we were doing the stakeholder engagement who said, we've got really good management plans that we've already prepared and we're already using. And that's fine. There are a couple of things to think about, though. The first one is, by using the template, you're being consistent for both yourselves and people having to deliver that, and also for the reviewers, so they know what to expect. Authors know what to include, and the reviewers know what to expect. So that's a benefit of using the template version. But if you don't want to do that, I do recommend that you at least look at the checklist, which is on that list of documents on access to evidence page. Because the checklist is simply a list of the headings from the main template, and you can simply look at that and think, have I covered this in my own management plan? And as I mentioned before, you might still want to have a look at the template to guide you, even if you choose not to put it in the template. So yes, you can use your own management and monitoring plan. All I would say is just make sure that you've incorporated into that existing plan what you need for biodiversity net gain.
And I think that's the trick, isn't it? And to go back to those brilliant tables, you know, I love the way it's so closely related to the target condition assessments in the metric. You know, there are some absolutely, and we've got so much to learn, you know, from the long-term management plan, you know, especially from nature reserves, you know, the way that it's adaptive changing. But this is now mandatory biodiversity net gain. It's very specifically related to target types, strategic significance, target conditions over that 30 years, rather than a kind of like, you know, let's see what happens approach. So I think it's the using that information, but being quite cleared to mandatory biodiversity net gain. Maria, thank you. I know, I really do. You know, you were there all the way when we were thinking, okay, this is a bit of a gap for us in ecology, and you were like, right, and you really owned and took away the fact that actually Natural England can support this, as always. So you've really led that development of the template, and thank you. And I do think it's so helpful, and thank you very much for coming today.
Thanks,
We've hit
Julia. I'll
2
just
o'clock, so
say as well
yeah,
that
go for it.
we will take comments on it as well, and eventually, you know, in time, do some reviews of it if people have feedback, and they can do that through that access to evidence page as a contact on there.
So everyone, thank you for joining us. Just a summary then, there's a legal requirement for the management and monitoring plans for on-site significant enhancements and off-site B&G provision. You might need management monitoring, you might, for retained habitats. Not all retained habitat. I obviously gave you an example of a woodland because that's an obvious one where you might need management. So those retained habitats are retained at the end of the 30 years because your development will be given consent on the statutory biodiversity metric. The Natural England template I find really helpful. You know, even if you don't use it, it gives you the questions, it gives you the exam questions to answer. Who's going to be responsible? Where's the funding come from? How are we specifically linking management to those target conditions, to those target habitat types, you know, like really making it that specific as well. And the monitoring aspects, we talked about those different levels of monitoring. There might be, like, if you like, that kind of internal monitoring, let's make sure B&G is on track. There's the monitoring reports to submit to the local planning authorities. And if your local planning authority, what can you do now to really gather that data, not just to keep track of B&G, but to set yourself up for those 5-year reports. The start date. I know that there's not, I wish there were like a really black and white, clear answer for the start date. So this is about case studies. This is about sharing experience. This is about this brilliant B&G community being supportive and knowing you have to have a clear start date of your maintenance and just making sure that it's aligned with your specific development using the guidance from the government. And if you're an offset provider, welcome. You might well be doing this for a long time, and we really welcome you to the B&G community and the B&G family, but just let's make sure that we're all working from a consistent basis. So thank you. Cheeky plug, we've got another webinar coming up. It's all about the Biodiversity Net Gain Register. You don't want to miss that one. It's on the CIEEM website. Maria, final point. Have you got a final word of advice for people who are maybe starting new to 30-year management and monitoring? If they're picking up your template, do they go to the companion? Do they go to the main template? What's your final advice about people who are looking at your Natural England template?
Take a look at the access to evidence page. We'll provide the link if it's not already, and have a look at the main template to start with. Because it does provide a bit of a step-by-step process of what you need to do in there. And also take a look at the gov.uk guidance, creating a habitat management and monitoring plan, which provides a brief summary and also provides the link through to those tools, all of those different documents.
Thank you very much, everyone. We know you've answered a lot of questions. We'll work behind the scenes. Keep an eye out on LinkedIn. As always, we'll be posting some of those. And thank you very much. We'll see you for the next one. Thanks again, Maria.
Thanks very much, Julia. Bye, everyone.